This video is brought to you by Aura. More on them later. Welcome to another entry where I'll be continuing on this journey as I draw my way through the alphabet. We're now on the letter B, and I guess to briefly explain what this series is, I'm basically going to be choosing an element from the 4 categories that you see on the screen. The catch is that they all have to start with the same letter, in this case the letter B. Once I get an item in each quadrant, I'm going to then try to combine all of these 4 elements into one drawing, and hopefully it'll be coherent. But enough explaining, let's move on to our first category, movies. I was deciding between a plethora of different options like 1989's Batman or Batman and Robin, Batman Forever, Batman Returns, Batman v Superman, Batman Begins, The Batman, and of course, Back to the Future. I think it's pretty obvious which one I went for. Moving on to the next category, and this one was also tough because there's a lot of great shows to choose from. Batman the Animated Series is great, there's Breaking Bad, Bojack Horseman, Bob's Burgers. Honestly, it was really tough for me to decide. Eventually, after much consideration, I ended up choosing Bojack Horseman because this show has a very special place in my heart, and I just love it. Next up was video games, and this one was pretty much just a toss-up between 2 different series. Batman, okay, there's a lot of Batman in these lists, but the Batman Arkham series is Rocksteady at its peak, and they're just great games, Arkham City being my favorite out of the bunch. Borderlands 2 is another one that I have great memories of playing with my friends back in the days. Although I'm a bigger fan of the Batman Arkham series, I ended up choosing Borderlands 2 because I thought visually it'll be more fun and more unique to do. Last but not least is location, and I also had just 3 main choices for this one. I was contemplating between the beach, the bar, and to a commenter's suggestion, Ba Sing Se. I kept going back and forth, but ultimately I went from flip-flopping to just flip-flops. Now that we had our 4 main categories figured out, it was time to get all of these pretty different elements onto one canvas for our drawing. But before we have Bojack, Claptrap, and Marty McFly having a nice day at the beach, it's time to share a word from this video sponsor, Aura. A few months ago, National Public Data announced that they had suffered a major breach which compromised over 2.9 billion records used for background checks, including personal information such as full names, addresses, dates of birth, phone numbers, and most importantly, social security numbers. Personal information security is such an important topic in this day and age, and we're all more vulnerable than ever in today's digital landscape. From having too much information online to receiving spam calls and texts daily, all of this can get extremely overwhelming to deal with. Thankfully, I feel secure because of today's sponsor, Aura. Aura not only monitors your personal data, including your social security number, across billions of data points like the dark web and public court records to alert you about potential identity theft, but they also provide up to $5 million in identity theft insurance in case the worst happens. Plus, Aura offers a variety of other features to keep you safe online, including real-time alerts for data breaches, a VPN for secure browsing, data broker opt-out to stop companies from selling your personal information, a password manager to help you create and store strong passwords, and much more. I don't feel comfortable leaving myself vulnerable to data breaches, and if you don't want to either, click the link in my description or you can go to aura.com/ChunnyK to try 2 weeks for free. That will allow Aura to help you find out if any of your personal data is exposed. Our first step is to work on the rough sketches, aka the brainstorming process. This one took me a couple of tries to get right, and for this rough sketch, I thought it might be a fun idea to have Claptrap making sandcastles while Bojack is in the water, and I pretty much ran out of ideas. I didn't know what I was doing with the DeLorean stuff, so I just put him in the water. And it was at this point where I realized I wasn't having that much fun, and I wasn't really feeling what I was drawing, so I immediately pulled a Thanos and reduced this illustration to atoms. The second attempt went so much better, and I took the things I didn't like from the first iteration and simply didn't do them. Instead of having everything be so scattered and far away, I made sure to have the subject up close so there can be some semblance of composition. Bojack Horseman was my character of choice for this position, and again, I love this show so much and I really think this show deserves way more recognition. It's a seemingly depressing show yet also extremely funny, about a horse who is trying to relive his glory days of being a famous actor, but through his narcissism and addictions and insecurities, he ends up falling back down to rock bottom despite his and his friends' best efforts. Back to the drawing, instead of doing a scene with the ocean off in the distance like I had initially planned, I thought it would be a bit more interesting having the ocean be on the side here so we can have more room for activities on the sand. Behind Bojack is Marty McFly zooming on his hoverboard. Back to the Future is a classic that I absolutely love, and while the whole trilogy is a lot of fun, The first one will forever be the best one by far. But even still, I love the sequence with the hoverboard in the second one, which is why I decided to include it in this drawing. Next we have Todd over here with his head sticking out while he looks like he's having a fun time. Although his design is quite simple in the Bojack Horseman show, the simplicity actually ends up making him look a bit more complicated in my opinion, because if one thing gets off, then everything ends up looking off, so I tried my hardest to make it look as close as possible, although he's not perfect. Claptrap is a bit behind Marty and Todd's head as he's getting chased by a DeLorean, and instead of doing a sandcastle in this one as opposed to the previous one, I felt like it was a bit more fun to have him being chased. I also gave him the flux capacitor as a reason that he may be running away because he probably stole it. In the end, I chose Claptrap because, much to Handsome Jack's dismay, he's probably the most iconic character in my opinion. Also, he's just a rectangular box, so he's pretty easy to draw. Now that we have the DeLorean, I was contemplating between adding a Mr. Doc Brown behind the wheel, but I felt like I should have given the Borderlands series a bit more love, so I added a Psycho instead. I'm sure he's trying to go back to the future to get himself a copy of Borderlands 4, which I am cautiously optimistic on, but I'm more cautious than optimistic if I'm being completely honest. The sky also felt a bit empty, especially compared to the action happening on the bottom half of the canvas, so I added the balloon from Bojack in the distance. After combining both the major and the minor pieces, I thought that this was looking quite good and I was feeling very confident, but we all know my confidence is always short-lived because I knew I still had a lot to do. For this drawing, I wanted to try something I've never done before. I wanted to do a piece without using any line work or inking, and that meant using just the colors to dictate what's happening on the screen. Again, I've never done anything like this in the past, so I thought now would be as good of a time as ever to try a quick practice run. Call me Mr. Godfather because I used this horse's head to set an example. I placed down the base colors for Bojack, and then relying on the sketching layer, I was able to see where I should place some of these darker shadows. This lets me fill out some of the details and give this flat image some much needed depth. I was honestly really happy with how this was turning out, mainly because I was very pessimistic about it going in. After I finished with the highlights, I felt a bit of relief knowing that maybe it wasn't going to be as difficult as I thought, but I was very wrong. It was really difficult, but we'll get to that later. But that's enough talk about practice. After all, it's not the game, but practice. I removed the test colors I just did and added another layer so I can add even more details and clean out some of the line work just to make the coloring portion a bit easier later on. During this new layer, I did do some minor changes here and there, like moving around Marty's arm, or reducing the size of the balloon, and adding the infamous Hollywood sign in the backgrounds. It was finally time for the coloring phase of this drawing, and it was from here on where the video started to take a very long time. I did wish I could have gotten this done faster, but due to my inexperience and very slight incompetence, when it came to colors, textures, shadows, highlights, positioning, perspectives, proportions, hands, it's no wonder it took as long as it did. That being said, I pretty much did the same process that we saw from the test coloring earlier, and I got the base colors for most of the characters on the canvas before moving on to the shadows or the lighting, or even the background with the sea, the sand, or the sky. I ended up putting in a temporary color for the beach and the ocean because I knew that this would take a while, so I didn't want to spend too much time on it just yet. I moved on to Bojack to start working with the shadows, and I mainly just looked at the sketching layer to see where the lines would intersect with each other, or where they would break off from each other, and then I just added some shading in those spots. I highly recommend this show for anyone who hasn't seen it. It's a pretty adult show with adult themes and topics, and the writing is superb. The first few episodes are a bit rough, and it does feel like a discount Family Guy at times in the first season, but once the show finds its footing, it is a masterpiece in my eyes. Now that both Todd and Bojack were as shady as can be, I started working on Marty and his hoverboard. Back to the Future is a film that I revisit every couple of years, and it's a movie that I'll keep watching throughout my life. It's honestly just a load of fun, but the same can't be said for Marty's pants. I had a really hard time trying to capture the texture and the feeling of denim, so I basically just tried to use a bunch of different brushes and textures until I found one that looked half okay. Claptrap is next in line, and because he's just a rectangle, there wasn't that much I needed to do for him. But yeah, once the characters and their base colors plus the shadows were done, it was time to tackle the biggest hurdles in this drawing, which were the backgrounds. The sand and the sea gave me so much trouble that you're going to see me attempt to restart them many times in this video. But before we get to all of that, all I did so far was to add different shades and tones to the water, so it didn't appear too flat. The foam for the water was a bit of fun to draw, but this is the definition of random. I added random lines, erased random parts, and added random shades to make it seem more like an organic piece, but even with all of this work done, I wasn't really feeling the drawing at all. Instead of sulking, I decided to just work on the sand, and you're going to see that I put in a lot less effort into the sand because I figured I'll just change it later on anyways, and I didn't want to put in that much effort if that was the case. Procrastination hit hard after I added those squiggles, and instead of continuing on with the background, I just went back to the characters to add some more shadows so I could really flesh out these figures. There was no rhyme or reason to what I was doing with this drawing. I was pretty much delaying the inevitable until I came back to work on the background. I decided instead of trying to remedy what I currently have, it might be better just to start again, so I Thanos'd those layers and this time chose a bit more of a lighter base for the colors. I started doing something similar to before, but this time I tried to make the water look a bit more clear and slightly more cartoonish. These lines and the close shadows gave it a much more shallow feel, which is what I was going for. Then I made sure to color the sand darker the closer it was to the water because, I guess just because wet. In the process of cleaning up the look of the sand and the water, I gave the Psycho and this time-traveling car the same treatment, and afterwards I added the sky and the mountain in the back. I took a much needed break from this point, and when I came back, I didn't like how the foam turned out, so I just redid that portion to make it smaller and again to make it feel more shallow. And since this is the ocean and oceans love to wave, I made sure to add a mini one forming just behind Marty. I think this one addition helps a lot to add to the overall vibe of the beach. It was at this point that I didn't really know where to stop with the water, so you're going to see me keep adding these random lines and shades. I did try to add a very blurred version of Marty's reflection to the ocean. I think I went over ambitious because it doesn't look that good in my opinion. And yeah, at this point in time, or I guess any point in time if I'm being honest, I didn't really know what I was doing, so I just kept adding pieces until I felt bored. Now we've reached my mortal enemy, sand.
I don't like sand.
Me neither, Anakin. Me neither. But not because it's coarse and rough and irritating and it gets everywhere, but mainly just because I suck at drawing it. I gave up on the sand in the meantime and started working on these highlights for the characters. I used a new screen layer and the airbrush tool to let these highlights shine. Literally. As you can see, they did have some issue with shining a bit too bright, but that's nothing a little reduction in the overlay couldn't fix. I'm also not entirely sure if this is the best way to go about adding highlights or even shadows, so please let me know down below if there's a more official way to go about this. I repeated the same process for every character, and still not wanting to work on the sand, I gave myself another executive order. I wanted to make it look like Marty was zooming on by, and to get this effect I tried using the fingertip blend tool to add these smudges near the end of the character. That way I can use the smear look to emphasize speed, and might as well call him Lightning McQueen, cause ka-chow. I was basically done with the drawing if it wasn't for the freaking sands, and I yet again redid the whole process. I tried a bunch of things to get the sand to look good, but each thing I did ended up making it look worse in my opinion. There was a point in time where I felt like maybe I should just give up entirely, and I pretty much lost hope. Instead of settling for good, I thought it might be good to settle for okay, then I thought it might be okay to settle for alright, then I thought it might be alright to just settle for meh. But through sheer stubbornness, I finally drew some sand I was happy with. For this one, I started with a darker base and using the highlights to fill out the areas instead of vice versa. Then I would add darker shadows to make these hill-shaped thingamajigs, and once that was done, I added some sand rocks. This went from being okay with looking okay to me actually thinking, you know, it looks pretty okay. The last boss was finally done, and now it was time to go for these little side missions to get that platinum trophy. The clouds were quick to do and the balloon was nice and fun. I changed the opacity levels on these multiple cloud layers so the balloon had some variety in their transparency, and finally I added the Hollywood sign. In the wise words of Frodo Baggins,
It's done!
This drawing challenge was really hard for me to do, and it makes me wonder what the next few iterations of this challenge would look like. After all, we're only on the letter B. That being said, I was really happy with how this ended up. I've never done a drawing like this where I didn't really utilize any line work or an inking layer, and at first I thought it would end up catastrophic, which it kind of did, but I'm happy that it somewhat resembles the prompt. I've been getting out of my comfort zone more and more with these drawings, and I'm enjoying the feeling a lot. The water is still quite rough, and the sand does have a lot of work that needs to be done still, but honestly, I'm just happy with the image overall. As I've mentioned before, this is just our second entry in the drawing through the alphabet challenge, so if you haven't seen the letter A, please give that one a view because that one was equally as fun to this one, probably a lot less aggravating to work on. Anyways, I hope you can leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you want to see more, And most importantly, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.